happy to welcome today Pascal Coppens, an insightful and very generous observer of Chinese innovation and the country's economic and technological challenges and transformation. With over 20 years of experience in China and Silicon Valley, he has deeply studied China's rise to power, particularly through his books, China's New Normal, and also Can We Trust China? Beyond his writing, Pascal Coppens is also a very sought-after advisor for many companies looking to better understand and anticipate China evolving dynamics. He has had the opportunity to work directly with entrepreneurs, investors, decision makers on both sides of the globe, giving him a unique perspective on innovation in China and in the West. In his work, Pascal Coppens consistently analyzes how China has evolved from a mere technological follower as a global innovation leader, competing with traditional Western models in diverse fields such as fintech and smart cities. So today, Pascal Coppens will share with us key insights from his upcoming books, China's Next Miracle. And he will explain how China is striving to create a new post-COVID economic miracle, a fourth one. And unlike in the past, this transformation will no longer rely on low-cost mass production, but rather on an accelerated shift from quantity to quality, with a central part for automation, robotics, and AI. While Europe historically transitioned from quality to quantity, China here seems to be taking the opposite path to establish itself as a global center of excellence. For China, actually, AI is not a challenge, but a key solution to today's economics and societal challenges. So this talk will thus offer us a fresh perspective on how China is reinventing its economy through AI and emerging technologies. So please join me in welcoming very warmly Pascal Coppens. Okay. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll talk a little bit more about my new book. If it's okay, I'll stand up and I'll talk a little bit and give a sneak preview on a book that I'm writing, and it's almost finished, and it will be available by the end of this year. I'm not promoting the book, but the content is quite interesting, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. And this is about how to decode the innovation power that is behind China. So within the book, I'm talking about what I call China's next miracle. But to understand that, we have to look at China's first miracle. And if we look at China's first miracle, 1990, this was the first time I arrived in China in 1990, so a long, long time ago. And it was really the moment that we created, or China created the factory of the world. They became the factory of the world because there was three things that they needed from us. They saw the West, Europe and America as the rich client, a new client for China. They wanted money, of course, they wanted expertise, and they wanted technology. What we wanted from China was, of course, a new big growth market. We also wanted a lot of cheap labor, and they had a lot of people. And we also wanted a country with a good policy for manufacturing. And so this is how China slowly became the factory of the world, and we send all our factories to China. But the question is, why did China really become the factory of the world? Because if you look at market labor and policies, India had a very good chance to become the factory of the world too. They had the same amount of people, huge market, and great policies towards manufacturing. But it didn't become India, it was China. Same for Indonesia, same for a lot of places in the world. And so I believe this has to do more with culture of China than it has to do with the fact that they have a lot of people at cheap labor. And one of the things Chinese are very good at is coordination. They're very good at coordinating everything. That's because they learned that at school as a kid, being very structured. My daughter was going to school in Shanghai, and it's all about structure and coordination. That helps in manufacturing. But it's also collective society. What that means is that ultimately, if they trust the people around them and they trust their leader, they like to go all in the same direction. That's a huge power for creating manufacturing in itself. And it's also a very pragmatic society. What that means is simply they don't want to spend more energy than needed to get the results they want. And they love money, the pragmatism of money, and they want to work really hard for it. but they also want to make sure that when there's a problem, they solve the problems. And so in manufacturing, that is one of the reasons that China is so good, to solve their problems. So this is why China became the factory of the world. And why am I saying this? Because this is the same reason why China is becoming the innovation power in the world. And it's not because of the number of people and other things. Now, people who didn't go to the factories in 1990, they went to the cities to build cities from scratch. City like Shanghai, where I lived for 18 years, doubled its population in just 30 years' time to 25 million people today. City like Shenzhen did not exist 40 years ago. Today it's 20 million people. There's more than 100 cities in China with more than 1 million people, bigger than Brussels. And all of these cities, if you would be able to go back in time 30 years, you would not recognize anything of these cities anymore. That's the transformation of China. But the biggest transformation has been its middle class. Today, we're talking about 230 million families. That's about 500 to 600 million people that belong to the middle class in China. They have the same quality of life as we in Europe, in Belgium, in the middle class. But 15 years ago, there was no middle class in China. This all happened in just less than a generation, and we can't really imagine this. Now, the problem with all that is there's a lot of consumption. Great for a good market, but there's also a lot of production, and what's the problem? A lot of pollution. And that is what happened with the country. It was very polluted. 10 years ago, I was living in China, and ultimately, some days you didn't want to go outside. It was that bad. Now, the good news is that Xi Jinping, a couple of years ago, 4 years ago, he pledged at the General Assembly of the United Nations that by 2060, and 35 years from now, China will be carbon neutral, CO2 neutral. And in 2030, and 5 years from now, it will peak. Now, if that would not happen, I mean, our grandchildren would probably not have a nice place on this planet because China still emits 27% of all the carbon dioxide of the world into the atmosphere. So the good news is that Xi Jinping has this vision, this plan, but can we trust it? Will it happen? Well, we have to look at the facts a little bit. And if we look at the energy, the renewable energy capacity that China has built just over the last 5 years, this is 4 times more than the European Union, 5 times more than the US, and with Trump who wants to drill more, it's only going to increase that gap. And with India, it's 8 times more. So China is now being called the first electrostate in the world. Just like Saudi or Russia or Texas is a petrostate, China will be the main source for renewable energy products and anything we get. That's just a fact. It's not a story from Xi Jinping. It's just happening. Now, I want to go to the second miracle because, as you said, there's 4 miracles, and the second one started in 2008. I was experiencing all 4 miracles, and the second one was the digital transformation. This started around 2008 with the Olympic Games. You might remember that in Beijing at that point. This was the moment where China was looking at Silicon Valley, the moment they saw that they could use software to really create value in a very different way than the hardware they've always been building before that. And suddenly they say they can scale and become entrepreneurs and have risk capital to really grow and become rich with software just like Silicon Valley. In 2008, every entrepreneur in China had Silicon Valley as their big example. But they did it a little bit different. And that was because the market in China was different. First of all, the Chinese entrepreneurs are much more competitive, which means you don't have one product, you have 1,000 products all wanting to do the same thing. And then they want also to capture time. People spend time on the apps, not a share of the wallet. They didn't want to make just money from the apps. They wanted people to spend more time on the apps. And that's what we have with these apps coming out of China. It's all about attention span rather than how much they spend on the apps. They can make money in a different way later on. They make money by providing convenience in the app. So when you want to rent a bicycle or you want to do something special, that's when you need to pay some money. And that's a very different way of thinking. This is how these applications out of China became very different than the applications coming out of Silicon Valley. And the result is that Silicon Valley today is copying whatever China has done in the past 15 years because they feel this is really like TikTok and Temu. I mean, people love it. I mean, it has problems, but they love it. And so this is why this is all changed. Now, 2008, if we look at this graph, and you might know this graph, if you look at technology impact in the world, over time, this is an S-curve. And simply in the beginning, the law of Amara says very clearly that we, in the beginning, overestimate during the hype phase before technology, like AI, becomes really everyone is using it. Ultimately, we overestimate its potential. But we tend to underestimate the long-term effect of technology over time. And that's no different between China and the US or Europe. We're all the same. But there is a difference. One of the differences is that China builds applications much faster and many more applications for the real world. So you have much more choice, and they're much faster to the market very often, with as a result that this hype phase is much shorter. And so the Chinese, they're not overestimating this hype phase at all, because by the time they figure out there's a hype, there's already applications to use it in society. But what they do is underestimate much more than we do the long-term effect. And because they've underestimated for the past 2 decades the long-term effect of technology, this is the reason why they trust technology much more than we do. Because they've seen a positive effect on society much more than the expectation they had themselves. If you look at most of the countries in Asia or in the developing world, they had the same situation. They came from very little or less than we had, and so technology improved their lives much more. The trust in technology, the trust in AI is critical to understand how China is evolving so fast. The problem with us here in Europe is that we're not looking at China when it comes to their technology. So we're underestimating pretty much everything that comes out of China. So the gap between what's really happening and what we know about it is actually even bigger than in China. And the problem is that because we're looking at, if we think about AI and we think about ChatGPT, we're looking at constantly the US and Silicon Valley, we don't pay much attention to China until we reach the point of no return where the Chinese come to our shores and start selling their products into our markets. Think about electrical vehicles. And then suddenly we're surprised that all these products suddenly are market leaders and we don't know where they're coming from. And it's not that the Chinese are smarter in innovation. It's just we weren't watching. We have no interest in what's happening in technology whatsoever coming out of the East. And as they are now coming more and more towards Europe and America, that phase, that point of no return is becoming shorter and shorter. And that's something to know. Now I'm going to jump to the third miracle. And the third miracle started in 2015. This is the moment where China started to change from copycat to creator, from manufacturing really to an innovator. It was all about innovation. This is where Xi Jinping, in 2015, launched the Made in China 2025 plan. 10 years later, he wanted to be at the same level as Germany in terms of Industry 4.0, in terms of manufacturing. But he also said that by 2030, that's in 5 years from now, China will become the leader in global innovation. And these words created all the tensions with the US. The fact that he had the ambition to steal the throne from the US created all the tensions. It started with telecommunication war, later it became geopolitical. Ultimately, under Trump 1, it was a trade war. Now he does that again, he loves tariffs. And then it became a COVID war during the pandemic. And then under Biden, it was all a technology war, where most technology, high-tech technology from Silicon Valley, from China, from the US, but also from Europe, were not allowed to be sold to China anymore, whether it was chips or software or AI or it was quantum or it was biotech. Chinese could not get access to the latest and the best technology anymore. And this all started with their ambition to become a leader in innovation. But the interesting thing is that only 13 years ago, 2012, we were all convinced 100% in Europe, in America, that China would take at least 20 years to become innovative and probably never catch up with us. How could they? Why would they? These same magazines 8 years later talk about this technology supremacy race between China and the US, where it's not clear anymore who's winning and who's losing, and AI was at the center of this battle. So what is it that we've missed? I mean, we underestimate China constantly, but the biggest thing that we're missing or not watching when it's about China has everything to do with talent. If we look at talent and we look at STEM graduates in China, science, technology, engineering, and math, I mean, more than 30%, almost 35% of all the STEM graduates in the world are coming from China. More than 20% are coming from India. So those two countries together is almost 60% of the world's STEM graduates. So how can these countries not become innovative? There's smart people everywhere in the world. It's just China and India have many more than we do. And in America, there's 820,000, but half of them are not American or born in America, or they're not second or third generation Americans. So that is a very different thing. Now, they're not just in quantity the best, very often also in quality. If you go to the Mathematic Olympiad that's held every single year, 2 years ago, 2023, it was in Japan. I don't have pictures for last year, and it's always the Chinese that come out number one, boys or girls, 17-year-old boys and girls. Does anybody know here who number 2 is? Make a guess. India? That would be logical, right? But it's not, no. France? No. It's America. I'll show you the Americans. I think this tells it all. So there is a real geopolitical war between China and China. They just don't have the same passports. That's the real situation these days. And there's some Indians there too. So is China ahead or is China behind in terms of innovation? Well, there's a think tank in Australia called ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and they have made a 3-year-long research to figure out who is leading in the world. They research all the countries in the world in terms of critical technologies. And critical technologies are technologies that are important for economic development for a country, but also for its national sovereignty. And they came out of these 64 critical technologies that they analyzed, is that China is leading in 57 of the cases. And in 24 of them, they just have a monopoly situation already today. So we can't catch up pretty much in 24 of these areas, like electrical batteries is one good example. And America is in 7 places, and this is like natural language processing. I mean, now it's all about large language models and so on. It's also about genetic engineering, about nuclear medicines, about vaccines. It's about what Elon Musk does with small satellites, quantum technology, and something called atomic clocks. There must be some people very interested in that technology. But these 7 things is what America is still ahead. Now, what worries me is where's Europe? I mean, nowhere on the list. And I've read the whole report. You can download it online, so it's publicly available. Europe is not even coming, the countries are not even coming on the 2nd place. They're always on 3rd, 4th, or 5th place. Most of them, they fill 3, 4, and 5. But it's always America coming 2nd if China's 1st. And otherwise, it's South Korea and India. And so one wonders, where is our Europe? And this is very, very frustrating for me as a European, knowing for the fact that if we look at the Global Innovation Index, where you look at the most innovative places to innovate in the world, 21 out of 30 most innovative places in the world are actually in Europe. So why are we not being more innovative and having the output? We have all the brains, but seems not the gains that we want to get. Somehow America and China is much better at scaling and getting the results. Now, the interesting thing is that if you look at China, just 15 years ago, they were only on 43rd place in terms of innovation. They move up 5 places almost, or 10 places almost every 5 years. Now they're on number 11, and they're going to join the top 10 club very, very soon. So they're moving very, very fast. So if we want to look at our innovation in Europe, we can't just keep looking at Silicon Valley and the US. We have to look also at what's happening on the other side of the ocean. But the interesting thing, and that's what very few people know, is that China is looking at Europe as an example today. Not because of Trump, but because it's not about digital and software as much as it's about other innovations and about general combining hardware and software. And they believe, and they're right, that Europe is very good at creation, very good at efficiency, very good at quality, because we have a very sustainable mindset. It's not just about making money, it's about making something sustainable. And the Chinese want the same thing. And that's why they love Europe right now, our heritage, our education, but also a sustainable mind. So they copy a lot of Europe, even our laws they copy. I don't know if that's a good thing, but they do that too. And so this is where China is now looking at Europe. And they want to create these blue oceans. But China is used to create red oceans. I don't know if you know the difference between blue ocean and red ocean, but the blue ocean is actually a new market where you set a standard because you came up with a new medicine or a new concept or ChatGPT, and everybody else has to follow you because you were the number one. A red ocean is a market where there's already a lot of customers and opportunities and clients and money to be made, and everybody jumps in that same red ocean. That's what's happening with electrical vehicles now these days. Everybody wants to build an EV. And so the Chinese, they love red oceans because they know there's money to be made. But they also know it's very competitive. But they rather compete than be unique in many times. And so the Chinese, they compete like crazy. That's why I don't call it a red ocean, I call it a bloody ocean, because it's a bloody gladiator fight to the death, and I've been fighting it for 20 years living in China. I know how hard it is. But the Chinese have in mind, if there's money to be made, let's just jump in that ocean. Well, we prefer to build blue oceans. And for blue oceans and innovation in a blue ocean concept, we ultimately need to start from quality. We need to have great ideas, great creations, great theories, great things that we built in universities and everywhere in order to make products that are really high quality. And so we go through a process from quality to quantity, which you explained as well just before. It's about ideation, validation, then we experiment a little bit, we find money, ultimately we build some minimum viable product, and then once we have this first product, we bring it to market with some guy that gives us the money to do it and some marketing strategy, and that's how we go. And the Chinese do the opposite. They start from quantity and go to quality. As soon as they see a market, a red ocean, they jump into that ocean. They start building whatever they can. They know there's a client. Sometimes it's rubbish in terms of quality, but they don't care. They just want to experiment and learn in the market what it works. And so they build very quickly for a market that has a demand. And they learn over time in that market, while we learn in our laboratories and in places that are more safe. They go immediately and jumping in that market. If they don't do it, somebody else will outcompete them. And then they validate how that works. But what we miss in that whole story is that the Chinese actually start the innovation at the end of this process. And because they don't start in the beginning for many new products they build, we think they're not good at innovation. They just wait until they have the room and time and money to do that innovation. And so that's a different concept. And the result of it, in that red ocean, going so fast is that you can speed up, you can scale up, and you have a lot of performance available. And that's what China's very good at. Well, we're good at quality, at efficiency, and at everything related to ideas and creation and new things. So this is the reality between the West, or Europe, and China. And it's almost like a blue and a red pill. Are we going to have to continue to choose, or can we continue to choose to take more and more blue pills, believing that we will always be right, knowing the fact that the world is changing so quickly that unless we start taking red pills and go really for that market and that change, we're probably going to be get outcompeted by the Chinese electrical vehicles, to give you one example. And this is really where Europe is in a situation where we feel we have to keep our model alive. And the Chinese say, yeah, but we have our model that works too. But why not combine both? And why not work with Chinese or adapt to Chinese? And because they are also trying to adapt to our model now. And there we can get two pills, create a blue ocean or purple ocean from the blue and the red. And ultimately, we can work together. The problem is, we often look at China as this being a nightmare. We don't feel very comfortable working with these Chinese. I mean, can we truly trust China is the question that we ask. And what's behind China? What is China's purpose truly? What do they want to achieve? And will this hurt us or will this help us is the question. Well, we have a lot of stories about China's purpose. What is it that they want? Do they want to create a new world order, like Putin has said it literally what he wants to do? Or maybe it's all about hard power, the biggest military in the world. Maybe China wants to create a hegemony just like the US in the South China Sea and Taiwan. Or maybe it's all about soft power. And with the trade imbalance where they have a surplus of $1 trillion already, maybe they can just pressure us in doing whatever we want. Or maybe it's all about becoming the #1 technology, and specifically in AI, where they start dominating whatever is intelligence in the world. Or maybe it's just about resources, where they just want to control everything in the world. Or maybe it's about controlling 1.4 billion people. These are the stories we constantly hear. And this is what worries us. And I believe China's purpose is a lot simpler than that. What most Chinese, pretty much all the Chinese want, is just one simple thing. They want to stick together. They know they're in deep and troubled waters. They know they're not good at swimming yet, but if together they can catch that next wave, they know China as a collective society will be on top. And that will benefit every individual. And so all the narratives are nice for us, but the Chinese believe something very, very different. And I always say China's cyclical. There's moments of lots of control, and there's moments of letting go of control. But we tend to see China as a linear progression, usually linear downwards. It's going to fail. But China has moments where there's lots of control. During the pandemic, you had a lot of control. Of course, the Chinese will say it's about controlling the virus, while other people in Hong Kong might say it's more about controlling people. And maybe businesses will say it's about controlling entrepreneurship and businesses, and that's all the things that we experienced. The Chinese government said we just had to clean our house to make it clean so that we can grow again. Because that is what Europe has been doing over 100 years. We only had 10 years or 5 years to do it. We don't have all the laws that Europe has. So we've been doing that. But that was a downward cycle of lots of control. But now we're in an upward cycle. And it started about last year, officially in 2023, but you could really start seeing in 2024, and definitely this year, 2025. If you see, this is a picture from a railway station in China during Chinese New Year. There's never been as many travelers in Chinese New Year as just last 2 months. It's an incredible amount of consumption that has happened the last 2 months, which we've never experienced before. So consumption is back up. And the stimuli that the Chinese government is giving towards this consumption is going through the roof, and the Chinese completely wants to go on that trend. Also, if you look at the stock exchange, since there was stimuli, it's all going up, and specifically tech stocks. Now, even Jack is back, Jack Ma. So there must be something happening in China, right? Well, there is an animal spirit coming about, but we haven't figured it out yet. And so there's a lot going to happen. But at the same time, a lot of people believe that China could be failing. I mean, there's a lot of problems, so maybe it will peak, maybe it will go downward. The issue I have with that statement is that since 1990, since I've been in China, every year I've read a magazine in the US that was predicting that next year will be the final year that China will actually collapse. And Gordon Chang, he wrote a book about that. I can truly recommend you never ever to read that book. It's a book I read, and he predicted since 2000, the year 2000, 25 years ago, that next year China will collapse. He's one of the best paid speakers in the US right now about the collapse of China. He's been wrong for 25 years, but that's fine. Don't worry about that. So the coming collapse of China, I don't really believe it, but I do believe in the fact that there are a lot of challenges that China is facing. And that has been caused because of the growth of China that has been a lot based on infrastructure, on real estate, on lots of things. So there are systemic and societal issues. There's also a lot of geopolitical tensions that was created over the last 6, 7, 8 years, since actually 2015, you could say, but mostly since Trump. And so there's a lot of issues. And the question is not, does China have problems or not? The question is, can they solve their problems? Can they deal with it? And here's the interesting thing. That really depends on how we look at the model. And very often, when we look at China's real estate crisis, or we look at any problem that there is in China, we tend to use our model in Europe, in the West, to project what China should do in order to solve their own problems. And so we have a more liberal, market-driven, capitalist society where we believe our model should do this. You should invest more, or you should change the interest rate, or you should do all these things to make it happen. And China doesn't seem to be doing all that. They do some of it. And the reason they're not doing all of it is because they have a state-driven and also market-driven hybrid system. And so sometimes they can say, okay, now we can use that state bank and the state enterprises, and sometimes we let the market play. And so they can balance whatever they want to work with at the moment they need it. And so they believe their model works very well. Now, the interesting thing, if you talk to Chinese and you use their model to look at our economy, you get the exact same stories and the exact same words where the Chinese are saying, Europe is going to fail, America is going to fail, because they do not believe that we will be able to deal with all these problems because they look at it from their own system. Take jobs, for example. China has a lot of unemployment, and we say China has a huge issue in terms of unemployment. And the Chinese say, yeah, well, you have a huge issue in terms of jobs. AI is going to take all your jobs away, and if it's not AI, it's going to be the Chinese. It's as simple as that. And for each of these, I can tell you a story. And so the question is not so much who's right and who's wrong. We just believe that our model is the right model and the other one is not going to be the right model. And if we look at China in theory, in fact, I mean, they're still one of the best in class. They're still growing at 5% in terms of the economy. This year again, 2025, that's the projection. And that is adding the GDP of the Netherlands to their GDP every single year. So that's not nothing. And if you look at production or industrial output, 45% of all the production output or industrial output in the world by 2030 will come from this one country. So China by 2030, in 5 years, predicted will be bigger in manufacturing than all the high-income countries together in the world. So the factory of the world is not fading away any day soon. But somehow, China's failing, right? Well, they do have problems. So we are looking a lot at the door that is closing. What we're not doing enough is looking at the keys that they're trying to open new doors. And it's these keys that I explain a little bit in my book, which is calling China's next miracle. But I didn't invent this idea. The Chinese government came up with a model, which I want to explain, which is called New Quality Productive Forces. 新质生产力 for those who speak Chinese. And so New Quality Productive Forces is something almost, who's heard about this? You do. We should all be talking about this because this is 10 times bigger in intent than Made in China 2025, which created all the geopolitical tensions between the US and China. Imagine. This is 10 times more important. And the New Quality Productive Forces is pretty much a complete paradigm shift for China. And so we're talking about China should reform, but they're doing a complete reformation of the mindset of China, how to drive their economy. It's a paradigm shift where they want to achieve higher standards of output. This is the quality of Europe that they want. But they also want the same productivity as European companies in having more efficient utilization of the resources. And the most important is they want to transform the economy. They don't want to solve or improve the economy. And they want to transform the economy, and I'll talk a little bit later about that, because they don't want the drivers of growth to be the old drivers of infrastructure investment and a lot of export. They want new drivers. And these new drivers are, for example, new industries that they want to go to, new technologies, new infrastructure, but also new business models. And there's a lot of new industries where we don't talk too much about these days in the world, but in China, it's going really high speed ahead. Humanoid robots is one of the biggest trends for 2025. They have the hardware that they figured out how to make it work. They can improve it still. At the VEB in Brussels, they're doing a great job, for example, but they need to learn from them. But in software, I mean, AI is actually helping them to make it much more efficient. And so this is a big trend. They're putting everything on that. I think if you don't want to do the dishes in the future anymore, you're going to buy a Chinese robot in 5 years from now. It's as simple as that. Mobility. If you look at electrical vehicles, I don't need to talk about that. I mean, everybody knows China is leading that pack. But I think the real transformation of EVs in Europe will not be because of batteries. It will be because of self-driving and autonomous driving. This is what China is light years ahead of the rest of the world. Only in Silicon Valley they can keep up with China in terms of self-driving. There's 65 cities in China where you can get a robo-taxi already. So this is a huge trend. Of course, the low altitude economy is a new economy, like flying taxis. We've been in one in April, but also space travel, which is happening as well, space tourism. And the new Airbus or Boeing that China's building themselves, the C929 and C939. So these things 5 or 10 years ago were non-existent in China. And today you can see flying taxis in China. You can see all these things, humanoid robots used everywhere. You can see self-driving taxis. But also in things that we don't talk too much about, like biotech or chips or the clean tech. I mean, China doesn't want to take the top end per se, but they want the other 90% of the market for themselves. And that is where we will buy Chinese drugs, I mean medicines, simply because it's the same approval that they got, same regulation, the same process. It's just a lot cheaper because they have these factories to build it. So this is what China sees as their new growth model for the future. Now, it's not just about that, it's also about new technologies. And with DeepSeek that came about just at the end of last year, 27th of December, the whole world, specifically Silicon Valley, was like, what just happened? I mean, how could we not have seen this? It was like every tech boss in America was surprised. And I was like, yeah, but I've been talking about this for 2 years, and everybody in China knows this for 2 years. I mean, somebody had to pop up to do this, but why would they? How could they? That's the question we still forget to ask. I don't know if anybody heard about Manus, the AI agent. You did? Well, you're in a very specific area of AI, but 99% of anybody who uses ChatGPT has never heard of what just came out of China, one of the most powerful AI agents that is around. And this is all going to influence how we're going to deal with the world in the future. There's more than 200 large language models in China that have been approved by the central government, that are used by consumers in China. And none of these names we actually know of. Most of them we've never heard about. If you look at just patents or patents, what you see is that the patents, most of the Gen AI patents in the world are actually coming from China. It's as simple as that. But we all know that if we look at foundation models or pioneering models, I mean, there's only going to be a handful, maybe only 2, 3 remaining in the world, 2, 3 in the US and 2, 3 in China. And I've put the 4 on my wish list, which is Alibaba, DeepSeek, ByteDance, as well as Tencent. And we're always forgetting ByteDance. ByteDance is the company that owns TikTok. They have so much money and so much opportunity, but we're not looking at ByteDance from an AI perspective. Those 4, in my view, have the best chance, but all the others could potentially also become the number 2 and number 3. So we don't know this. And this is what I think we should start knowing. And if you go to the second point, the quality, what we see is that China really wants to improve its quality of products, create many more standards. This is what Huawei has been doing for many years, but now they want to do that in every industry. Much more efficient, and most important, to provide more customer value to consumers, to customers. We don't think about a communist party being customer-centric, but it's actually one of the most customer-centric places in the world. Why? Because they're not very loyal. If they find something else, they choose something else. And so you have to be customer-centric, otherwise somebody else takes your market. But they also already have all these high-quality products. If you think about the Xiaomi, the new car, the SU7 Ultra, I was in Barcelona Mobile World Congress 2 weeks ago, and it's a fantastic car. All the products from Xiaomi, including from Huawei, I mean, they're often already a generation ahead of anybody else. I mean, Apple is trying to keep up. Imagine me saying this. I mean, this is crazy. And so this is happening in the consumer market, but you see it in B2B, you see it in anything related to energy, but also in battery, they're starting to lead. Now, there's other competitors, like even in Europe and in Japan, in solid state and other things that we might be able to catch up or jump again, but in lithium ion, let's forget it. We've lost the game. It's game over. And so this is something China now wants, this quality everywhere. But what's most important for China is to create a higher productivity of its society. And unless they reach that, China might actually have a problem to keep growing. So this is the biggest pain point of China right now. It's about their labor resources. Most factories in China and most industries in China are only half as productive as what we are in Europe. So there's a lot of room to grow. That's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is like, yeah, we're doing great and they're not doing very well. The Chinese looks at it in the first way. And so the productivity is all about automation. It's all about upgrading the industries. And so the biggest trend that I see and the biggest transformation of the economy that I see in the next years to come is everything relating to the traditional industries. These are industries like healthcare, logistics, manufacturing, which are very low productivity 10 years ago. Some in the high tech like BYD and Huawei and some others, they're very high tech, but there's a lot of low tech still in China and they're trying to move that up. But China's goal is now, and the government has set this goal, to make as many dark factories in the world as possible. And a dark factory is not a factory that you can't know what's happening. That would sound like Big Brother. No, a dark factory is a factory where you can switch off the lights because there's no workers working there. And that is what all the electrical vehicles company wants to achieve in the next 5 to 10 years, even for wiring the cars. But also in energy grid, in construction, in agriculture. Agriculture is terrible when it comes to production, and they need to upgrade that whole thing. And so that's what they're doing. Now the problem is, how is China going to achieve that? And here's my 4 secrets that I want to reveal about China. How they will use different way of thinking and a different strategy, a different model in order to actually outcompete many in this world. And it's 4 A's. The first one is about making everything accessible. They've done that inside China. And right now, this is, when it comes to AI, it's all about open source versus proprietary. So there's no war between China and the US in terms of AI. There's a war between China and the US in terms of proprietary versus open source. And China is going completely open source. And that's every company on that large language model list that I gave you is all going open source, and not just for software, also for hardware, open hardware. And that means that they can now have the whole world to contribute to their foundation model and their own innovation. And why do they think this is okay? Because ultimately they can then build the applications where they are so good and so fast at doing it. And the reason is because they could not get access to the foundation models that we had. They had to do it, but they can't keep up with the US very often, so they just open it up. The second thing is about making everything affordable. We know China is often cheap, and then we think it's cheap in quality, it's not good in quality. The reality is that they're dumping very often prices, and for AI, this is the reason why ChatGPT and all these products are becoming cheaper in the US. It's not because of OpenAI, it's because of DeepSeek. DeepSeek in May 2024, last year, lowered the price of the whole China with 93%. For all the prices of using, if you have the subscription for AI, for any product. So they're just giving it away pretty much. And they're giving it away, again, because they think they can ultimately make applications on top of it and do other things that the others will be too slow anyway. That has a lot to do with the fact that they don't have this cloud infrastructure that the US has been building, or moats that they've been building to protect everything around them. And so this is the OpenAI versus DeepSeek story. But it's also about making everything applied. And what that means is ultimately that they're looking at optimizing, they're looking at getting most performance. Remember what I said in the beginning with the factory of the world. They want to be very pragmatic. They want to be pragmatic, they are pragmatic, they don't want to use more energy that's needed, so let's optimize and do domain-specific AI models. And smaller models and larger models and a billion models, so that anybody who wants to choose is like a candy shop where you can choose whatever you want and whatever taste you like, because your industry or business needs exactly that. And that has been a result mainly because they couldn't get access to the high-end chips. And because NVIDIA didn't give them the high-end chips, I mean, the US didn't allow them to sell them. NVIDIA would have loved to sell them, but they couldn't, and same with ASML and so on. They now need to find a way to train these models more efficiently, and then for inference, they have to use less computing power with maybe Chinese chips from Huawei, and that's the direction they're going. So they're not going to need the US chips anymore if they optimize much more than we do. And the last thing has to be about anchored, and that has related to the government. The government is pushing AI into the world, into the Chinese society. And they're pushing AI everywhere. Every harbor in China is now using, or is starting to use DeepSeek, imagine. So every port in China, but also most of the local governments have started to use DeepSeek. And so this has everything to do because they can't just burn cash like Silicon Valley does. They have to find different ways. And the government, they're not burning cash, but they're ultimately supporting these institutions and these entrepreneurs to build something unique. And now I want to show you one of the things that we at Nextworks, I work together with Peter Hinson, he's one of my colleagues, talk a lot, always up. It's about building long-term value. If you want to build long-term value, what you need to do is spend about 70% of your time, budget, attention, and people on ultimately today. You need to spend 20% on tomorrow and 10% on the day after tomorrow. That means look for inspirations outside of your comfort zone, outside of your industry, outside of your country to see what's happening out there. And then there's, of course, Peter calls this the shit of yesterday that we have to deal with. Every company has to deal with that. And that's negative value. So that's the problem we have. We can't create a lot of future value because we're constantly building or taking care of old value. And if we look at China, they're doing exactly that. They're doing exactly that with this new quality productive forces. They're upgrading their traditional industries, and that is 70% of all their effort and money that goes towards that. That is the main attention that China is putting on today, because unless they get the productivity up, it's not going to work. 20% on the new business and about 10% on the day after tomorrow and disruptions and moonshots, innovations and stuff that could really change the world. China has a lot of shit of yesterday, and they need to deal with that as well. But China has one advantage. They have a party, a communist party, that takes care of a lot of that shit. And so they can actually deal on a lot of these things about the future, and sorry for my English. But the problem with that, again, is that we're watching China wrongly. Only 20% of our time we're actually spending on how they're upgrading traditional industries. Mostly if we're in the industry ourselves, we are watching it. Otherwise, we're not. And we're spending most of our time on what China is doing with flying cars and with humanoid robots and with self-driving cars and the cool stuff, and can they build chips or not? And we're completely not watching what the day after tomorrow is and what they're building for tomorrow or for the day after tomorrow and to forge that future. And that last one, that day after tomorrow, that has everything to do with the last point, which is the forces. And the forces has everything to do with creating scientific talent, to create better talent. What the Chinese want to do and the government wants to do is very, very simple. They want to educate 1.4 billion people. They know that these 1.4 billion people have 2.8 billion hands, but their brains are much more useful. And in the past, they've used mostly the hands. Today, they say, if we can use the brains, that is where it's going. In China today, 6-year-old kids are getting classes of artificial intelligence. This is creating the scientists for tomorrow, the engineers for tomorrow, those that are going to make or break whatever is going to happen in the day after tomorrow, in that future. And they've done a lot of these things already in the recent 5 years. A lot of these inventions, a lot of these patents, a lot of these research papers that came out of China that never saw the light anywhere in the world except in scientific magazines. We don't read or hear about it. But all of these things could completely change how the world will work in the future. It could solve things like climate change, or slow it down at least, and a lot of things that we even don't want to talk about it because it's coming from China. And so the question is, does gravity then not apply to China? The fact that they see the sky as the limit and everything seems to be great and better. I mean, they have all these problems. I think the answer is pretty simple. It really depends whether you take the blue pill or the red pill. Do you believe that this is the end of China's miracle, or do you believe there's a potential next miracle coming up? And if you want to know more about it, by the end of this year, you can read my book. It's all in detail. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Pascal, for this absolutely enlightening presentation. I would like maybe to open the floor, maybe first here or online. Are there any questions for Pascal? Yeah.
There's a mic.
There's a mic.
Thanks for this great talk. I read a book recently called The End of the World is Just the Beginning by Peter Zane.
Okay. He's not my favorite author, but...
I was wondering what's your opinion on his take on the problem of demographics in China and how the aging population is
So we have I have a big disagreement with Peter when it comes to demographics. But his view, and it's statistically proven that the demographics is going to slow down. In China, the number of people working is going to be the biggest problem because there's no children being born. And so he predicts, or there's a prediction by 2100, that China will only have 800 million people instead of 1.4 billion people. And in the next 10 years, he predicts China is going to collapse because of that. I have a very different view on that because, first of all, I mean, he's looking at it very much from a statistical point of view, but China is not about statistics. There's a lot of things happening in China that are different. First of all, there's still a few 100 million people in China that are considered poor. For the next 10 years, 20 years, they are going to be the next workforce that are willing to work really hard. So that is not in that parameter that is described. The other thing is that I don't see the demographics as a problem of China slowing down in number of people as much as if I've been living in China for 20 years, and for the past 20 years, any taxi you take in China, the taxi driver will tell you, you ask the taxi driver, what's the biggest problem of China? They're all going to say one thing, too many people. So the Chinese want the demographics to go down. Of course, the transition is challenging, but everybody wants the demographics to go down. At the same time, the Chinese are in a liberation mode. What that means is that people want to study longer. They don't want to work as hard as their parents did because their parents worked really hard, so they can afford not to work. That's why you get unemployment. And so there's a transition or a liberation going on in the society where women don't want to have children because they want to take care of their career first. And so this is a transition that every country in the world has gone through, but that is never into these statistics, that it's actually related to that transformation of society and not related to just people going down. So maybe in 10 years, the Chinese will have more children again. I don't know. But there could be a good reason, once they can afford it, that they would want to do that. And the government is doing a lot for that to make more affordable houses. Because the main reason they don't want more children is because it's too expensive to have 2 children. Because 15% of the salary in China is spent on your child. You have 3 children, you can't live anymore. That's the problem. So there's a lot, I could go on and on and on. But what I'm saying, there's a way to look at it from numbers point of view. There's a way to look at it from inside China and what drives China. And when we talk about AI as a last point, which I think is interesting as well, the Chinese have already made that switch, that they know that they will have less people. So AI is the solution for their problem. It's not the problem for the solution. So they don't see it as a problem as much as a solution. So they will go for that. And the only thing to keep that economy growing is that they need to have enough customers. And so consumption needs to go up in China. They have a lot of savings that they're not spending, and the rest of the world needs to keep buying from China. That's why they need higher productivity and higher quality. So I don't agree with Peter.
Thanks. And maybe just another question. You mentioned that we're not looking at most of the things that are happening in China. We're not monitoring because we don't know the technology. What would be your advice on how to best monitor whatever's happening and being developed over there?
But from an innovation and technology point of view, you can subscribe to my newsletter. So every month I write about this. I'm not the only one. There's many people writing about innovation coming out of China. And now that DeepSeek has happened, now that the economy is going back, we're going to hear more about it. It's just that we need to spend more attention on it. And I think Trump is also helping us to not always look at the US. So I think it's going to be a natural transition for Europe as well.
Other questions?
Thank you. Any other question? Yes, over there.
Hey, Pascal.
Hi.
Compared to your previous book and
Yes.
this one?
Can we trust China?
Yes. What is the topic that changed most?
Compared to my previous book? Well, the previous book was a book that was written during the pandemic, during the geopolitical tensions, during a moment where we started distrusting China very, very much. And And I thought it was important for me to write a book about how the Chinese look at all the things that we have in our mind about China. So I provided a Chinese lens on it. Now, I feel we're in a completely different era, an era where the Chinese have gone through all that pain, which Europe is now just starting to go through that pain. So we'll go through the same trajectory as China did just 7 years later. But China has had the US challenges that we are now facing. And now we're in a new era where ultimately China believes that they can achieve what they want to achieve, and they found some solutions. And so this book is more about the future and how solutions could be happening, and I'm calling it China's Next Miracle, not because I believe it will happen, but if it happens, then we need to know why it happened. And so I'm trying to explain the why or what that China intends to do to make it happen. Whether it happens or not, I don't have a crystal ball. I can just say that I believe this could be happening. And so it's a much more a book for, I would say it's much more a book that helps to make sense of how to deal with the Chinese rather than to understand them. Yeah, thanks.
Actually, I have many questions.
Okay.
The first one is seeing your first point, necessity sparks innovation. I think it's super interesting. DeepSeek might be one of these examples.
It's one of them.
But then I'm thinking, why is Europe not able to do the same as what's happening in China? That's my first question.
Mm-hmm.
Second is a bit jumping on what was asked before on demography. I'm wondering, okay, if AI is now the solution for China to less workers, how would it work when those workers are not paying taxes, the state has less resources, etc.? You know where I'm going? Like if there's less workers, there's less maybe... So we need to change the way taxation works, or do you have a take on that?
Yeah, so...
And
yeah, I'm going to forget your third
There's
question.
A third one. Third one is broader. It's just, where do you see cooperation between the EU and China on AI?
So on your first question on innovation or necessity that sparks innovation and why Europe cannot do it, I think it's the model that is challenging us. So there's two things. First of all, I think we've been too dependent on the US. Where we didn't feel the necessity because the US protects us. They give us the cloud infrastructure. They give us everything that we need. And that's all nice, but with Mr. Trump, we suddenly feel that this might be a little bit of a problem moving forward. And so now, for the first time, we are waking up. I mean, we had many signals to wake up, but it's like this alarm clock that always goes on, and you just make sure that you keep sleeping. That's Europe. On the other hand, I think we're looking at China in a wrong way. And I always say, and through all my books, this is what I write, we're looking at China top-down. We're looking at a communist party that we call a dictatorship that is ultimately controlling 1.4 billion people and dictates everything. If you've lived in China, you know that an entrepreneur somewhere in the country has no message or interest whatsoever in that story. He wants to do it for himself. He wants to improve his own life. And so I often say that China is the most decentralized dictatorship that you will find in the world, while we in Europe are the most centralized democracy that you will find in the world, which means that we centralize so much into a democracy that ultimately nothing happens. And the Chinese decentralize so much into their, I would say, control or state-driven engine that a lot of it happens. And I think the answer is to give more authority, like in China, to the local governments, but have more control on how they do it. But I'm not a politician. I'm just saying this is what China does very well. It's a combination of this entrepreneurial power. And then if you look at the local governments, that is the secret to the success of China. It's not the central government. Local governments work together with entrepreneurs, together with companies, and they compete against other local governments. They compete against other entrepreneurs in that red ocean. And because of that, there's a complete startup, let's survive environment where the government is included. Beijing is not. They make sure that everything happens on long term. And so I think the model works very well. Our model has worked very good for decades, for 2 centuries, because of this blue ocean creation model, but when everything changes and the paradigm changes, we're not going to survive in that model. Specifically when everything becomes open and transparent, meaning you can just get everything online pretty much. How are you going to protect yourself? The Chinese, and I've written that in my previous book as well, the Chinese feel that the reason that, so we feel that they got rich because of us. They feel that we protected everything we had against, for them not to get access to with intellectual property. Now they're using that against us because they think that model works. And so that's the whole thing. So I think in general, I think it's China is going to transform very, very quickly, and we're going to have to learn. Your third question was on demography?
Where you see cooperation between the EU and
Yeah. Well, I say one of the biggest mistakes that I think Europe is doing, and I've never understood it, is that we have been working with the US against China. Somehow we have the same narrative. That's why we will never, as long as we have the same narrative as the US on China, we will never be autonomous. We will never have autonomy in Europe. That's my view, because we can't have autonomy against China if we have the same narrative as the US, because they have a different goal. They want to be number one. We don't want to be number one. And so I think the issue is really that Europe makes a huge mistakes already for many years to look at China as a risk and America as an opportunity. And what we should do is simply put America and Europe against each other and basically work with both and and get the best of both worlds. So if we put one up against the other and we look at them at an equal level, we will get the best of both worlds. But what we're doing is get the worst of both worlds. We're not getting anything from China that we want, like technology very often. We get their products, but we don't get their technology. And we're taking everything from the US that we might not be able to get in the future. So I think that's a mistake. But now we're getting very philosophical. Yeah.
It's very refreshing to see, I would say, a different perspective on China rather than what we see in Europe. My question would be, what would be the sort of best way to, as a European, to make business with China in terms of mindset, culture, I'd say adaptation or perspective, in this idea of competitiveness versus uniqueness?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a take on that?
Yeah, but I think we don't need to adapt that much simply because the Chinese have already adapted to us. Most of the Chinese, specifically the young Chinese, they want to build these blue oceans. That's how DeepSeek came about. Manu's the same thing. They want to build these moonshot innovations. So we don't need to start to learn to do everything and work like crazy like the Chinese do, because the Chinese don't want to work crazy like that anymore in the future either. So they're moving towards us. What we need to do is move a little bit more towards China, because that represents not just China, but how the world is being run these days. It's about speed, it's about agility, it's about flexibility, about making friends with people you might not like and stuff like that, because it's pragmatic. So we need to become more pragmatic. We are too ideologic in Europe, and we're always saying that China and Xi Jinping, it's all about ideology. I believe we are way much about ideology in Europe than China is.
You tell us that the government gives authorization to put a large language model in China on the market.
Yes.
So what about the AI regulation in China? How they do manage that?
So China has an AI regulation already for over a year. They were one of the first to set up a kind of regulation, but it's not a strict law regulation yet. It's not like the AI Act as going as far, but they have a really big vision. Typical China has a long-term vision, and then they fill in the gaps in between during that trajectory. But towards companies in China, towards anybody who puts these large language models onto the internet or have on apps, they're very restricted in how they can use it. It's even like that if you use AI to create anything, you have to mention that on that creation. If you don't do it as a consumer or a company, you can get fined, or you can actually get in trouble. And getting in trouble in China is not always a good idea. So the companies ultimately are taking very much responsibility about making sure that this is according to the privacy laws, according to the AI regulation, meaning like that everything is authorized, but also is checked in terms of algorithms when it's about AI algorithms. So there is a process. But as everything with China, they do it very quickly, but then they build as they go. And this is the quantity to quality thinking. And so they are still building that, but they're making huge progress every time. The problem is they're stuck between Europe and the US, where Europe is the framework they would like to go at, but at the same time they don't want to be outcompeted by the US, so they leave some room to wiggle, otherwise they might have a problem with the US large language models.
One last question, maybe? Okay.
Thank you, it was very interesting.
Pleasure.
And I have a wide question. I like your model of blue and red pill, but I'm wondering whether China has already moved to purple somehow.
Okay, so yeah, you need the mic.
Yeah, sorry. So thank you very much. I had quite a broad question. I liked your model about blue and red pills, but I was wondering if China had already moved from red to purple, and how should other countries react?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I don't think China has moved from red to purple for two reasons. One is that I think some people, younger people and entrepreneurs are in the blue area, and then there's all the workers that are still in the red area. So there's a combination of the two. So they take both pills. But they're also alternating the pills. In the morning they take a red pill, and in the evening they take a blue pill. What that means is that they start by working hard, and once they get some successes, that's when they actually start. So it's not about taking the two pills together. But China's so big, and there's so many things happening, and so much change, that ultimately you see a lot of these both directions happening at the same time. And that's why I always say I feel very confident about the future of China from a youth perspective, because the young generation, the new Chinese kids under 20, 25 years old, are so much more similar to our kids than before. And so there's the biggest problem of China, in my view, is not so much a demographic problem, it's a generation gap, where the young people have a completely different ambition of their future than people who sit in Beijing. And luckily, there's the local governments and local people in between that whisper in their ear that China is changing. And so because of that, I have a lot of trust over the next 10, 20 years that the younger generation will actually come up with the same blue oceans, but they will still have their parents working like crazy.
Okay, thank you very much. One last maybe question from me, if it's okay. I would like to know, hearing your views on the future to come, especially from China, is it still worth working on AI in Europe?
Very much. No, I think Europe has gotten a wake-up call from Trump, but they also got a wake-up call from DeepSeek, which was positive, meaning that open source allows Europe to actually develop anything that they want and not be dependent on the US moats that were built or castles that were built around the AI technology from the US. And so with the fact that China is looking to collaborate, and with the fact that much more will be open and transparent coming out of China, I think Europe has a huge opportunity to build their own model. And so, yes, I'm very positive. I think the 200 billion or whatever it was that was decided in Paris was finally a good decision that we took to actually go with it and do something with it. Now, if we're going to effectively use that money, that is a big question. But I think it's not game over for Europe. I think it's a new game that starts, and either we play or we don't.
I see your view. I see your point of view, indeed. But the regulation, though, are simply fairly different compared to what we've seen with the AI Act here, and the more, let's say, organic way of building regulation in China. So do you see there a potential issue between any AI growth or AI capability of working together?
No, because I think most of the focus that China will do will be on the application side and maybe on the middleware, so anything on the framework, but not on the foundation models. The foundation models, I think, There will be 3, 4 remaining, and everybody will be using them. But on the application level, I think that's where there's a lot of things that we can learn and get from China, which could inspire us to do things as well. So I don't think the regulation will slow down that application level as much, but we will have to abide by the laws, and so will Chinese companies. So I think China is moving towards Europe in terms of regulation. They just take more time to get there. And so in the meantime, there's the applications that will be built. And so that's the opportunity or the risk, depending on how you look at it.
I see. Any other question maybe from the web, or no? Nothing? Okay. Well, Pascal, thank you so very much for your time and for sharing with us your views today. We'll definitely be looking forward to September when your book is coming out.
It might be October or November, but don't pressure me.
Well, you said, following China's example, time is of the essence.
Yes, so I need to speed up. Understood. I will.
Thank you so very much.
Pleasure.
I appreciate.
Thank you, Mathilde.
Let's give him a vast round of applause.
Okay, we're offline. Thank you, everybody.